Enoch was well known to ancient believers. He lived before the flood and was 365 years old when he was taken up to be with God. After the flood, there was an exponential decay in age. The change was due to the firmament canopy over the earth. In the Hebrew, it was called the Raqiya. The Raqiya was like a force field over the earth. It caused an increased oxygen condition, which allowed for greater healing and less cellular deterioration. This can be verified through hyperbaric oxygen chambers and by the amber fossils, which contain tiny air bubbles of higher oxygen amounts. The Raqiya may have also contained a thicker gas, liquid, or solid layer of ice that was held suspended by a powerful electromagnetosphere. Accredited physicist Dr. Simhony Menahem discovered that when applying 1.02 megavolts of energy anywhere in space, out popped an electron and a positron. As a result, a crystalline lattice would be generated. This lattice would allow gravity, radiation, and particles to interchange freely through it, but it would also reassimilate harmful radiation. This also means that before the global flood and the destruction of the Raqiya, there were also no free radicals. Free radicals are generally oxygen molecules that we breathe in. They are sticky and bind easily with harmful pollutants. This oxidative damage shortens our lifespan due to the damage that is made on a cellular level. At the collapse of the Raqiya, the fountains of the deep have broken forth as well. The Bible talks about these subterranean chambers breaking free. These underground liquid chambers were under extreme pressure, similar to volcanic eruptions. Dr. Walt Brown, a mechanical flood engineer, discovered evidence of this in his research and coined it the hydroplate theory. As the fountains exploded with extreme pressure, magma and water reached supercritical temperatures that would have in turn shot supersonic jets of steam through the surface of the water and caused instant and intense global rain in the atmosphere. The excess rain probably settled in the polar ice cap regions as well as blanketing some of the northern regions into a mini ice age, which is exactly what we see in the past. This would explain why we find rapid frozen animals like woolly mammoths and sauropods in Siberia and Alaska. The hydroplate burst seam can be seen in the mid-Atlantic ridge and would also account for the continental shifting of land, the relocation of major mountain ranges and trenches. This is why we see bottom-dwelling sea life fossilization on some of the highest mountain peaks. The flood would also explain the rapid burial of animal fossilization, polystrate fossils, layered strata, and the coal and oil deposits. After the collapse of the Raqiya and the global flood, the environmental conditions were no longer as favorable as they once were, which is why human lifespan rapidly decreased, including the dinosaur population. The rapid decline of dinosaurs may have been due to the small lung capacity and the nostril passageways being insufficient in carrying enough oxygen to the heart and organs. The Bible refers to dinosaurs in the original Hebrew text. However, the translations in the English include behemoth, leviathan, and serpent. One of the lost fragments of Enoch was the Book of Giants. The lost fragments are manuscripts that are not completely preserved. The Book of Giants tells the dealings of the fallen angels and the Nephilim offspring. It focuses on Oya and Haya, two children of the fallen angel Samyaza. It tells of the nightmares and dreams that many of the Nephilim are having. The dreams are interpreted as coming destruction by floodwater. As a result, the fallen angels have Enoch intervene for them before God. Eventually, God hands down strict judgment by means of the flood in order to preserve his chosen people and their lineage. However, after the flood, the Nephilim are repopulated again by fallen angels. With secrets of wisdom, knowledge, and technology from their heavenly fathers, the Nephilim start great civilizations all over the world. They create pyramids, megaliths, and monumental structures made of metallithic stone blocks that mirror cosmic constellations and signs in heaven. One of the famous kings known in the biblical history is King Og of Bashan. An interesting story surrounds him in Talmudic literature. Of all the giants, only Og escaped destruction in the flood. Noah made a place for him near the lattice door of the ark, though which because Og had sworn to serve Noah and his descendants for all time, he handed him food every day. The Talmud references Og as a Hay Palat, meaning the escaped fugitive. However, this is likely a fabricated story developed over time through Talmudic tradition. Further down in the Old Testament, we see in Moses' time that great nations have risen up all around the world. At the time of the first Passover in Egypt, the Israelites are commanded to smear the blood of the sacrificial lamb on the doorposts and thresholds of their homes. This is a pagan practice in which many of the Egyptians and Gentiles keep idols or inscriptions of gods on their doorposts. The belief is that the god of their home will protect them from another spirit that may come to try and bring destruction to their household. God relates to his people in the context and culture in which they are able to understand, so the Israelites obey and seal their homes with the thrashing of the blood of the lamb on the doorposts before the spirit of death sweeps through the city. The smearing of the blood paints a picture of the coming sacrifice of Jesus and his blood shed for the believer. As a believer is washed by the blood of the Lamb of God, so too shall the death pass over them. The fashion in which the Israelites applied the blood on their doors was a cross-X pattern, similar to the way that Christ would later receive his stripes at the end of the cat of nine tails whip. After leaving Egypt, Moses and the Israelites eventually encountered giants in the Promised Land. The Bible says how the Israelites were like grasshoppers in the sight of these giants. The Bible also refers to these giants as Amorites, Canaanites, Zamzumims, Anakims, Amims, and Rephaim. We see that in the Old Testament they are rampant throughout the land and have dominated much of the surrounding area. Not only in the biblical lands do we find giant remains, but all over the world. In China, some of the earliest Nephilim remains were found. They adopted giants into their armies and had them guarding the Peking gates. It is also recorded from travelers and historians that one of the emperors kept 500 giant archers and soldiers in his army, from which many of them reached 15 feet in height. In 1947, explorers in California found giant tunnels with giant 9-foot skeletons. They also found a ritual hall with Masonic-style markings which appeared to be the tribal burial chamber. Stranger remains have been also found in Pennsylvania, in which several 7-foot skeletons with horns were found. Ancient Paiute Indians described red-haired six-fingered giants that would terrorize their people. In 1911, miners digging in a cave found mummified remains of a giant red-haired skeleton which confirmed their stories. It is also important to note that many of these remains contain 6 fingers and double sets of teeth, a common trait of the Nephilim which is believed to be caused by a duplicate gene. Ancient antiquity and remains also show that giant cone skulls were very common. Many ancient people worshipped giants as gods, and mothers would often wrap their babies' heads to simulate this. These giants often personified themselves as gods, and as a result, much idol worship arose. One of the more popular forms of ancient idol worship was Baal worship, which is linked to Nimrod. Nimrod was the great-grandson of Noah. People began to worship him until Shem, one of Noah's sons, killed him. His wife Semiramis, or Ishtar, was left alone to rule. She is said to have been so beautiful that during a civil war, everyone came to a halt as she walked past. After Nimrod's death, Ishtar, meaning Easter, became pregnant with Tammuz. She claimed that the sun god Baal caused her to conceive. Tammuz would grow to be a great hunter like his father until he was killed by a wild boar. Ishtar claimed that her son Tammuz had ascended up to heaven to be with his father. Queen Ishtar became known as the Mother of God and Queen of Heaven. Queen Ishtar would eventually have eggs dipped in the blood of innocents. Although the origins of Easter and many holidays were originally rooted in paganism, what is important is that we as Christians recognize why we celebrate these holidays. Thus, the phrase, the reason for the season. Kukulkan was another giant who was worshipped by the Mayans. The Mayan leader is described as a white-skinned, blue-eyed, and silky-haired giant with an elongated skull. Similarly, Quetzalcoatl was the Aztec leader who was worshipped and possessed the exact same physical traits. These leaders are summarized as being pure Aryan. The cone skulls also allowed for greater considerable brain sizes. Many ancient drawings and etchings depict cone-headed leaders. King Tutankhamun, Nefertiti, as well as many other ancient kings and pharaohs had elongated cone skulls. Cone heads have also been found in Peru, Greece, and South America. Much of them have been preserved in the museums, yet are almost unheard of here in the West. Many skeletal remains have also revealed surgical operations like heart, brain, and eye surgery. The records from ancient people show that they possess certain abilities that modern science has just recently discovered. The Ica stones of Peru also depict heart surgery and the reconnecting of blood vessels through natural cellular repair processes. When looking at legends and myths, we find strange stories of animals with wings, partial human and animal bodies. Some believe that these were animal hybrids that were later turned into Greek myths and foreign legends. Extra-biblical manuscripts talk of fallen angels turning to animals and defiling themselves with them. It could mean that they cohabitated with them like the daughters of man, or that they genetically engineered or crossbreeded animals. Now, it is possible that some remnants of animal hybrid creatures could have existed, but probably died off eventually due to their inability to reproduce. As a result, they were few and scarce, which is why we find no remains or any solid historical records of them. In the Old Testament, Moses and the Israelites wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. They faced giants in the Promised Land and fiery serpents in the wilderness. The common interpretation is that these serpents were snakes. However, historical and biblical studies reveal that these fiery flying serpents were poisonous as well. Many of the Israelites are bitten and killed. Now, according to Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian, Moses employs a clever strategy to evade these flying serpents, which are actually flying pterosaurs. He writes how Moses wove baskets and placed birds called ibis in them. These were natural predators of the much larger serpents. As a result, Moses and his people are able to travel through an area in which these pterosaurs are numerous in size and number. Interestingly enough, another famous Roman commander by the name of Pliny the Elder recounts how the Egyptians used these birds against pterosaur serpents as well. Later on, in the Old Testament, David, a shepherd boy, has been anointed by God and called to liberate his people. David hears the taunts of the Philistine champion Goliath. Being the only brave enough person to take stand against the giant Philistine, David picks 5 stones from the brook and confronts Goliath on the battlefield. He says, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into the forehead and he fell face down on the ground, so David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. Although it was a triumphant victory, David picked up 5 stones from the brook. It was not that David thought he would miss, but instead he knew that Goliath had 4 other brothers. David was prepared to not only take out Goliath, but the reinforcements. David would not end up slaying the remaining brothers, but instead his faithful mighty men would. In one of the counterattacks from Goliath's brother Lami, David had to be aided by his mighty men. If it were not for David's mighty men, it may have been the end of David's life. It's often the counterattack of the enemy that gets us. That is why it's important to be surrounded by faithful believers, as faith is crushed easily when it is found unaccompanied. This is also why Jesus sent his disciples out in pairs, as there is strength in numbers. The first prophecy in the Bible pertaining to the Nephilim is seen in Genesis 3:15. It says, "And I will put enmity between thee and thy woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." The Nephilim were a form of genetic warfare against God's chosen people, and eventually the plan was to corrupt the bloodline of David, so that man could not be redeemed through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. David conquered the enemy in the natural realm, but Jesus conquered the serpent in the spirit. He conquered and accomplished all when he spoke the words, "And it is finished."